Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology Virtual Salons. We're really glad to have all of you with us today for this month's salon titled Explorations in Discursive Psychology. My name's Elizabeth Fine. I'm the curator of the 2020-2021 Salon Series, and in just a couple of minutes, I am going to hand the virtual podium over to today's chair and organizer, Laura Kilby. Or actually, I think I would probably, for this one, I'll probably hand it over just directly to our first speaker, Rahul Sambaraju. But first, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the salons and about the Crowdcast platform. I know we've got a few people here today who haven't been to one of these before, so just wanted to introduce you and show you around a little bit. So as many of you have already seen, we've got a chat window on the side here where you can introduce yourself, say hello, and share any thoughts or reactions you have to the talks as they're unfolding. If someone says something you think is particularly insightful or interesting, feel free to make a comment on it in the chat. We want these salons to be kind of like conversations, places where people can get together, engage, interact, spend some time, even though we can't be together in person. But if you have a question that you want the presenters to address during the Q&A, the kind of question you'd put your hand up for if we were all in person together for this presentation, there's a little spot down on the bottom where it says ask a question. And you should put those questions in that little box, in the ask a question box, because after our three presenters today are done with their presentation, we'll have some time for questions and discussions. So if you've got questions you want our presenters to address, click on ask a question and put it in that box there. You'll be able to see what questions other people have asked as well. Now, if you run into any kind of technical difficulties, trouble hearing, trouble seeing, you can put that in the chat. I'll be watching the chat and doing a little tech support. But one thing to know is most problems can be resolved by refreshing your browser window. So if you're having trouble hearing, trouble seeing, technical problems, try just refreshing your window. You'll come back in and often the problems will have resolved themselves. So if you see someone in the chat who's having problems, you can let them know that as well. I also wanted to let you all know a little bit about SQUIP. The Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology is a section of Division 5 of the American Psychological Association, the Division of Qualitative and Quantitative Methods. So if you like what you see here today, I want to encourage you to think about joining us. Membership is pretty inexpensive. We've got a bunch of different membership tiers, some of which give you access to our journal, Qualitative Psychology. But we rely on our membership and having a robust membership to advocate for qualitative methods within the American Psychological Association in all kinds of ways and in all kinds of areas. Our members are really important to us. So you'll see a little button down at the bottom of the screen that says find out about joining SQUIP. If you click on that, it'll take you to a page where you can do just that, find out more about joining SQUIP. This event is going to be recorded. And it will be available on our webpage, probably within about a week of this event. So if you want to watch it again, if you have friends or colleagues who wanted to see it but couldn't be here today, or if you'd like to use this event to teach in one of your classes, you can get to it on the SQUIP website, SQIP.org. Same website you can go to by clicking that green button. It should be posted there within about a week. And our previous events are there as well. We've had a number of salons so far that have been great. We've got a few more coming up. So keep your eyes on the website and stay tuned for those upcoming events. So what we are going to do is, as each presenter is getting ready to come to the stage, I'm just going to call them up onto the stage. So right now I am inviting to the stage our first presenter. Rahul Sambaraju is going to give a talk entitled, I Would Have Taken This to My Grave Like Most Women, Reporting Sexual Harassment During the Me Too Movement in India. Welcome.
Thanks. Thank you, Elizabeth. And thanks to everybody. Thanks to SQIP for hosting me, for giving me this opportunity. I know I cannot see you. I know you can see me. So it is a bit of an odd interaction. And I've been lucky enough this term not to be teaching, so so I didn't have to do this. This is my first time doing it. So please excuse me if anything goes off key in my presentation, or if I speed up any of these things. And I was just looking at the audience list, and it is really nice to see so many people I know from elsewhere. So many friends and colleagues are there right now looking at me speak. So thank you so much for being here, and hello, by the way. So my talk is titled, okay, I'm Dr. Rahul Sambaraja. I'm a social psychologist. I use discourse analytic methods. And my talk is titled, I didn't think it'd be that provocative when I did the title of it, but now that Elizabeth was reading it, um, I feel, right, I do feel it is fairly provocative. Um, okay, so so this talk today is about a study that I was doing on basically on media practices or Indian broadcast media practices that involve various issues and topics. And most of my research on this broad area concerned some of the pressing contemporary societal issues that people in India were facing. This included a range of other topics and concerns. And this particular paper that I'm going to present to you today deals with the hashtag #MeToo movement and how it played out, basically, in India. Now, I'm fully aware that I am presenting it as a heterosexual male, and this deals with mostly with women's experiences. So I am aware that I perhaps am not in the best position to take cognizance of what exactly several of my participants were talking about. And I think what I'm trying to do, at least in this talk and in this paper, was not to speak on their behalf or not to cover their side of the stories. But my concern today is something which is a very mundane thing that we all do, which is complaining. So what I'm going to be doing, talking to you about today, what the data will be seeing today, and the analysis that we'll briefly walk through, deals with complaining, and it's a very specific type of complaints that we're going to be talking about today. So when people were reporting sexual harassment in the context of the hashtag #MeToo movement in India and elsewhere, one of the things they were doing, or one way to think of women's activities in that context, is to think of them as complaining. Right? They were complaining about some personal grievance or injury that happened to them. So they were complaining in the public or to the public, and they were doing this as part of a social movement. Here, they were complaining as part of, when they were complaining, they were acting as members of a group rather than somebody who has merely an individual grievance or an injury. And a key aspect of these complaints was how it is that these were taken up. As we will see, not all of these were taken up as you and I would expect complaints to be taken up. Um, I'm sure all of you here know about the hashtag #MeToo movement, so not going to spend too much time on it. Just have a brief run through. The hashtag movement, as we know of it, was started by Miss Tarana Burke in the US, and India. It started in 2018, although Ms. Raya Sarkar started perhaps a bit earlier without using the hashtag. And what she was doing was she was compiling a list of academics who were engaging in problematic sexual practices. A core element of the hashtag #MeToo movement, among many others, one core element was that the recognition that sexual harassment is pervasive in a variety of workplaces, and B, that because there was a movement, it meant that when any single individual woman was reporting sexual harassment or complaining about it, she was not alone. that she was part of several, or she's part of this group she was part of as a woman. It was something that many other women would also have experienced, so she was not alone. And this is important because, and again, I think most of us here know this, that reporting sexual harassment is a huge problem. Just as many rapes and other forms of sexual misdemeanors don't get reported, sexual harassment at workplace also is not reported. So many surveys roughly say around 60 to 70% of women who experience sexual harassment at workplace do not report it. Um, Looking at this idea of reporting something that has happened to us in a negative way, because of our group membership, either in a gender-based group or a race-based group, is social psychologists would say that reporting these acts of discrimination is a problematic task. Uh, so, for example, Agostino's and Haas team, they look at the kinds of sexual harassment that the former Australian Prime Minister would have had to experience, and how it is that when she was reporting that as a Prime Minister on her political campaign trail, she had to face several sexist abuses. Her act of reporting these abuses was treated as something which is, why are you doing this? Can you not be sporty? Can you not just take it on the chin? Or just part and parcel, or she was being sensitive. Other research points to more broader societal, structural, cultural factors. So, for example, Bhattacharya says that in South Asian contexts, one of the things that happens is that women do not report because they don't want to come across as somebody who's possibly engaged in quote unquote bad behavior, or there is a fear that if a woman does go and report sexual harassment, their family might get in trouble. So some researchers identify these types of reasons as well. Um, from a discursive perspective, discursive researchers are interested in practices that comprise complaints. So how it is that one does a complaint, what it is one does not do so that their complaints come off as a complaint. And reporting discrimination, either sexual or race-based or other forms, is an act of complaint, because you're saying something bad happened to me, and it happened to me because of the group or the perceived group that I belong to. So for us as individuals who are doing complaints, a key thing is that we complain in such a way that our complaints are not undermined. I mean, right? We're complaining because we want something from it. At least the least thing that we want is that somebody recognize that it is a complaint. Um, so Edwards, for example, has examined a range of ways in which the subjective side of the complaints, right, what it is that we as complainers do, right, so that our complaints get recognized as complaints, right. And here, the couple of concerns that we as complainers have. One is that of personal stake. So people might think you're complaining because it suits you, right? You're complaining because you stand to gain something from it. Or the other could be that you're mourning. So as a complainer, one of the problems that we as complainers might have is people might think, well, you're doing it because you're a mourner, or you just whinge at everything, or this is something routine about you. So interestingly, one of the things that we as companies might do is we might want to mask the ready recognizability of our actions as complaints. So we want to get our complaints noted, at least recognized, so that somebody can do something, but we don't want to do it explicitly, so that because people might then say, are you mourning? Are you whinging? Now, so this is what a lot of research has examined to date, right? But when we come to the kind of data, kind of phenomenon that I'm looking at, here complaints are made explicitly as complaints, right? One of the things you're doing is that you're saying this person behaved in a highly inappropriate manner with me, right? So here complaints are made as complaints. And this was very key for the hashtag #MeToo movement, because it basically addressed the core issue that women's complaints or reporting of sexual harassment were routinely undermined, or they were dismissed. Um, and hashtag #MeToo as a movement in India and elsewhere, it started with identifying prominent public personalities who were accused of sexual harassment. But at least in India, in many of these cases, these complaints were dismissed, right? In the court of law, in their workplace, so on and so forth. Another interesting thing about doing complaints in the hashtag #MeToo movement was that these were public. These were made to the press. These were made in the media. So these were not interpersonal complaints where you might want to mask that you're making a complaint. And many of women's complaints were attributed to their personal motives, that this person was making a complaint to go up in their career, or just to seek some attention. So what I'm going to be looking at today is how it is that these complaints made in this context were actually made. Two, how it is that they were undermined, because that seems to be the outcome. And three, how it is that women might negotiate the possibilities of undermining these complaints, which are made as complaints. I was going to play a video as well just to get a sense of what these data were, but I think it's best that we don't for various reasons. So because the hashtag #MeToo movement involved public personalities, and because these complaints were made in the public, the data that I have are recordings of broadcast Indian media news debates, where the people involved were pretty much on camera. If not the person who was accused, at least the person who was making the accusation or the complainer was there. And these people were being then asked to broadly discuss about the issue, about their complaining, about the reporting, why it is that they did, why does it not do. But at the same time, one of the things that was also happening was that media were acting as the public, right? And in doing that, they were treating themselves as people to whom the complaints were being made. Um, okay, so I guess that the video did work. So here is first set of extracts where I'm only going to show you the questions that news media hosts ask the women who had complained about sexual harassment. Now, in all three cases, we see the common feature that the fact that women had complained at this moment, the moment, of course, is not one particular time stamp, but over a few weeks, let's say, right? Why that particular moment was chosen as the moment for them to complain. Now, I think when all of us read this, asking questions is why did you complain now? I think we all know, or we all get a sense that it's not an out of curiosity matter. It's not like I actually want to know why you complain now because was yesterday not a good day. It's not that kind of a question, right? It's not a question of why don't you do it tomorrow when all of us will be in the same room. But we all get the sense that it's a different type of question. It's a question that is almost being asked as if to say, why didn't you do it when it actually happened? And in the case of D'Souza, she pretty much says this, right? Why did you not do it 19 years ago when the incident actually happened, and why are you doing it now? So in all of these cases, at least on the face of it, the why now type of question is setting up an explanation. It requires the person who the question is being put to give a response, to say, justify why it is that they're making the complaint. Why did they report the incident right now? So it sets up an account, which is an explanation. And the other thing it also does, at least in these three cases, is that it makes it that the account that has to be now given should be given to the public. Now, so one of the things that the interviewers do generally, for example, is do a bit of footing shift. That is, they might want to present their questions are coming not from themselves or their individual interests, but on behalf of others, on behalf of the audience, right? Now here, however, it's not just on behalf of the audience, but there is a specific, or there is more specificity involved here. For example, you have interviews asking, what do you say to those who will say? What do you say to those who say? So in all of these ways, the public is pretty much presented as somebody to whom the complaint was made, and the media are just a party of people who are mediating between the person who's made the complaint and the person to whom the complaints were made. Another set of features in these questions were that the complaints were individualized. So, in asking this question of why now, the question is less about if they did it because of their group membership in one way or another way, but perhaps more about why does it suit you right now to make that complaint. So, there's a bit of individualization of the motive for which why they were complaining. So in that sense, in setting up an account to explain why they're complaining now, the legitimacy of their complaints is in question, and the legitimacy in question is also person specific. Um, so let's see how those who were asked this question will respond to it. One of the things to notice here is that lines 4 and 5. And not only is there a notable pause, which part of it you can attribute to the lag between the remote positioning of the interviewer, who's probably in the newsroom, and the person who's being asked the question, Sripada, who was somewhere in her house or elsewhere. But the other part, accompanied by the sigh and the deep notable in-breath, right, shows a bit of resistance to giving an account, right? And we see more of this resistance a bit more explicitly here. So at line 3, Sandhya Menon, who was a journalist who had accused few of her colleagues and her bosses who were acting in deeply problematic ways, here is being asked this question, and her answer at line 3, for example, is, "I won't dignify that question with an answer." So one of the things we see is that it's not just that me or you who thinks that when why now question is asked, that it's somehow problematic and it's trying to get a legitimacy of why the complaint was being made, but it's more than that, right? It is that the persons to whom the question is asked, they also treat it as potentially problematic. They treat it as something which is potentially undermining the very fact that they had complained in the first place. So they resist this, but their resistance is also notable because their resistance is given in terms of being a woman and not just in terms of them as as specific individuals. So, for example, at lines 4 to 5, Menon gives the reasons why the complaint was made now, or in the context of the movement, for example, uh, in terms of being a woman and not just in terms of being an individual. So, so while participants, interviewees did justify the reasons for complaining now in terms of what was going around them, which is the hashtag #MeToo movement. But they also did that as women and not just as individual persons who are concerned about who have specific reasons why they complain so late. I'm just conscious about the time, so I might just run through this last thing. So here, for example, what is of interest is that Menon, towards the end, orients to how the hashtag #MeToo movement itself is a problem. Okay, so uh, to conclude, what we see then is when women complain about sexual harassment, their complaints can be undermined in treating their complaints as coming from personal motives, that they want to have fame, they're doing it because they have an axe to grind, so on and so forth. Now, one of the things that complainers do is they negotiate this in situating their complaints as coming as members of a group. So instead of treating the reasons why they might complain as something that is personal, individual, they might treat it as something that deals with them as women. So gendering sexual harassment and how one makes a complaint allows them to attend to issues with legitimacy of these concerns. So I'm going to stop now because I'm over the time, but thank you, and we'll maybe perhaps have more time to discuss any of the issues in the question session.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. And yeah, we will have more time for questions and discussion at the end. So I see a few people are already putting questions into the Ask a Question box. But if you have more questions that you would like Dr. Sambaraju to address, please feel free to put those on in. Next up, I am very honored to introduce Dr. Laura Kilby, organizer for this session. Her paper will be titled Examining Mental State Talk Within Everyday Conversational Debate, Thinking on the Radio. Welcome.
Hi, thank you very much, Elizabeth. It's really nice to be here with the SQIP community. I've been a SQIP member for some years now, and I really enjoy the conferences. And whilst we can't be all together in one place this year, it's really nice to have these opportunities to still kind of be part of that community. So I'm just going to attempt to share my screen with you all. Okay, so hopefully now you can see my slides. There was a little bit of time lag when we were trialing this earlier with, I think, my connection, so I will try to keep things moving so that the slides are moving with what I'm sort of talking through. And the research that I wanted to share with you today is work that I completed with my colleague Ava Horowitz, who's based at the University of Lincoln. And this research is something of a departure from the research that I normally do. So most of my work is, in one way or another, analysing the discursive construction of identity. And often I'm exploring aspects of gendered identity construction, racial identity construction, and sort of related issues, and examining how identity work gets done and how it gets oppressed in and through talk. And one of the things that I noticed, and along with my colleague, over a number of years of analysing quite a lot of different collections of talk radio data, was that we were seeing an awful lot of people talking about thinking, and that people's talk about thinking seemed to be serving some quite interesting purposes for them in the development of their arguments and their talk in these public debates. And so we decided to take a look at that and see if we could get a better understanding of what it is that people are doing when they're talking about thinking, and why talking about thinking might be something that is useful for people to do when they're in the business of arguing and debating with one another. And so that was really our start point. And when I say talking about thinking, it's the kinds of phrases you can see on the slide. So people basically, you know, making statements like I think X, or I don't think X, or this other person said Y, but I think Z. So it's these kinds of statements that we are examining in this kind of analysis of talking about thinking. And my background is very much in conversation analysis and discursive psychology. And historically within CA, there has been research that's emphasised the way that think gets used, or the way in which it can suggest hesitancy or tentativity or reluctance. And that often that can be used as a means of managing tricky interactional business, such as when we're in the business of declining an invitation or rejecting an offer, that rather than doing the sort of CA dispreferred no, that we kind of do this things like, oh, I don't think I can make it tonight. So we kind of, it's a display of tentativity which can work to manage face or kind of maintain politeness. And then more broadly in discursive psychology, certainly over the past decade or so, there's been a real interest in studying what DP would refer to as people's mental state terms. So what it is we're doing when we talk about remembering or not remembering, what it is we're doing when we're talking about imagining or intending or knowing or wanting. So there's a whole body of research which has explored a range of these mental state terms, and thinking would sort of sit alongside some of those other terms as being, you know, a kind of an interest in what is it people do when they talk about thinking. And as we started to develop our interest in this study of thinking, we also identified that there was quite a substantial body of work in linguistics which has examined what linguistics refer to as cognitive verbs. And cognitive verbs are verbs such as believe, assume, think, know, and so forth. So they very much align with what DP would talk about as being mental state terms. And within linguistics research, what they point to is that cognitive verbs are used as a display of a speaker's level of commitment to whatever the matter is at hand. And so they talk about cognitive verbs displaying a plus or minus commitment to the particular statement or the argument that somebody might be making. And broadly speaking, the work within linguistics argues that think is typically a demonstration of minus commitment. So while some cognitive verbs inject certainty or absoluteness into the speaker's argument, so for example, when we talk about what we know to be the case, that's seen as a marker of plus commitment. But on the other hand, other verbs is a marker of minus commitment, and I think is understood within the linguistic research broadly to be a marker of minus commitment. And that maps on really neatly with the kind of CA findings which indicate that think gets used to kind of as a display of hesitancy or tentativity. So there's a real overlap there between those findings. But interestingly, within the linguistics work, there is also research which really emphasises that it's quite important to take account of the context in which the talk is being done. So Simon van den Bergen's work actually did a comparative analysis of the way that I think was being used in everyday conversations compared to how it's used in political interviews. And what that paper reports is that whilst in everyday conversations, I think does indeed appear to be mainly used as a display of minus commitment, when people are using this phrase of I think in political interviews, so mainly this is political speakers, actually it's used as a marker of plus commitment. So it bolsters the argument, it upgrades the commitment to the statement or the attitude or the opinion that's being shared. So this issue of context seems to be quite key. And that's interesting for us because our context of the research that we're doing is exploring public debates. So we've got a mixture of members of the public who are contributing to these debates alongside the host and normally one or two expert speakers. So we've got this interesting environment which isn't, you know, kind of political debate that's being primarily done by experts, but at the same time it's not everyday conversation. We've got this kind of public arena where people are participating, and our data is drawn from a national UK broadcast radio station which is Radio 5 Live, and on Radio 5 Live there is a daily broadcast show which is titled Your Call. And Your Call, it concentrates an hour of focused discussion that's always linked into contemporary affairs or kind of key major events of the day. And in the run-up to the session, to the Your Call broadcast, the host will promote the topic that's going to be coming up and invite callers to phone in and contribute. So there'll be kind of pre-promotion before that broadcast goes live. And they also typically will have one or two expert speakers who've been invited to participate in the show because they've been identified or deemed to have some sort of relevant expertise linked to the matter in hand. So in the actual broadcast itself, you will have a mixture of lots of everyday members of the public phoning in and also talking with and debating with one or two experts on occasion. So our data for this particular piece of research is a corpus of 11 Your Call broadcasts, and we selected the shows just based upon the show titles. So we wanted to capture just a whole array of kind of current affairs topics that would give a real range of the kinds of speakers who might be participating and the kinds of issues that they might be addressing. And that data set together comprises over 10,000 lines of transcript. And across that data set, think occurs or is stated on 708 occasions, and that also includes derivatives of think. So we included think, thinking, thought, thinks, and in any one show, think or one of the derivative appears at least 33 times in a maximum of 105 times. So this thinking talk is really very prominent amongst these talk radio debates. So through our analysis, we identify three kind of primary ways in which thinking talk is used as part of these public debates, and I will take you through them one by one and share some examples. So the first application of thinking talk within these debates is very much about work that the host does in order to create a particular kind of environment for these debates. And we see the host's thinking talk feature in two particular areas of his overall talk, or her overall talk. And the first one is when the host is inviting people to take part in the show, and that includes where they're the kind of preamble to the show where he's encouraging people to phone in. And then the other area where thinking talk of the host features is when the host is introducing or reintroducing callers to the air. So here's some examples. The first extract here, the host is saying, "We want your thoughts, 0500 909 693. So there's just this direct kind of request put out there to listeners to call in with your thoughts, and that's the phone number. And the other example there, "What do you think? Should taxpayers stump up so parents can stay at home?" Again, we see this quite common display of thinking talk in the preamble, where the host is basically asking this question, "What do you think?" and linking that to the particular issue of the show, and they will then go on and encourage the caller to phone in. And another example, or the final example on this slide, is the very typical way that callers are introduced onto the air or reintroduced onto the air. So this is during the live broadcast. So here we've got, "Let's hear from Angela. Angela in Oxfordshire. Angela, what do you think?" So these are the typical ways that the host is doing thinking talk. And what we suggest in our paper is that the host thinking talk is creating a particular kind of arena where the focus is on subjectivity. So there's no one single answer or one particular opinion or truth that this show is going to be about. And equally, there is no expectation that you need to have prior expertise or first-hand knowledge in order to be able to make a contribution. All you need to do is come along with your thoughts on the issue, and people are expected to think differently, and what you think is going to matter and is going to be valid. So that's the first application. The second one is the way that thinking talk is utilised by speakers in developing their opinions and kind of doing their opinion work. And this very much relates to the linguistic issue of commitment. And across the data, we see instances where I think is combined with other markers of minus commitment, but much more commonly we see instances where I think is linked to markers of plus commitment. So just like in Seaman van den Bergen's work, where she kind of pointed out that actually I think can be used to do both, but she was looking in two different settings. One was like everyday talk, and one was political interviews. What we found in this data is actually speakers are doing both minus commitment and plus commitment within this same environment. And I'll give you some examples. So here is a minus commitment. The host here is basically paraphrasing the argument of a prior caller and using that to frame a question to the next caller. So the host says, "So Mark, are the English arrogant?" And the caller responds with, "Well, you know, I think that clearly some English people are arrogant, but, you know, for the most part." So what we see here is a really nice example of minus commitment, where the think is linked up to a range of kind of dispreference markers. So we've got delay and repair and token agreement. And those things serve to allow the speaker to kind of move away from the argument. So he's not agreeing that the English are arrogant, but he's also doing that in a way which is not to be confrontational or to kind of roundly reject the prior caller's argument. So it just manages him out of a position where he doesn't want to agree, but he also is maintaining kind of politeness and face. So that's a kind of good example of minus commitment. In contrast to that is a really clear example of plus commitment. So here we've got a caller who's phoning in to participate in the debate that's midway through. And the caller is saying here, "I was driving along, Nikki, and I was absolutely appalled at the way Holly Dustin was spoken to. And I think she's a perfect illustration of how when women start to speak out about what's happening to them, they get silenced." So here we see a really clear pairing of the kind of thinking talk and extreme case formulation, which come together to kind of upgrade and bolster the argument that the caller wants to make, which is their kind of very strong subjective view in response to the debate at hand. So, you know, this is around women being silenced in kind of by men in a range of arguments and settings. So she's making a strong view here that's kind of using think and an extreme case formulation. So we've seen plus commitment and we've seen minus commitment. What's really interesting in our data is that the way that think can allow speakers to do both of these things, even in really short sequences of talk. So here's an extract. We go back to Mark. I showed you this extract a minute ago where Mark is asked if the English are arrogant, and he starts by sort of minus commitment of saying, well, I think maybe perhaps some people are, but for the most part, you know. So we get this nice minus commitment. And that very much presents Mark as a reasonable, making a reasonable contribution. He's not being confrontational in response to the prior caller's talk. And that reasonableness then sets up his next I think move, which is I think that other nations actually, you know, have a quite justified inferiority complex, and they're all too ready to take offence and call the English arrogant. So here we've moved from a minus commitment to a plus commitment in one really smooth flow of talk, which enables Mark to come off being reasonable, not being confrontational, but actually pose quite a strong view that actually it's other nations who have got an inferiority complex, and that's where the problem lies. So what we suggest in the paper is that I think seems to be a really neat way to manage what Mick Billig talks about as a tricky job. So situations where speakers are needing to identify with an audience, and also in this case another speaker, whilst simultaneously offering a contradictory viewpoint. And then the final application is managing facts. And there's two ways this gets done. The first one is really straightforward. It's where somebody is just got an uncertainty about an explicit fact, and they just want to voice that, and I'll just show you that briefly. So here in this extract, the caller's saying, and then you put someone who's incompetent, and as Parliament put it, Keith Vaz, I think, the chairman of the Homes Affairs Select Committee. Now, the I think there is just kind of bracketing off Keith Vaz because the caller is not absolutely certain he's got the right name. He thinks he has, and it's a really straightforward minus commitment. But I think what was really interesting was another use of the way that think gets used around facts. And it was the way that there was a kind of a pattern or a structure where we saw very commonly a fact is given and then it's linked to fact so I think, or fact and I think. And I'll just show you an example here. So the caller's saying there are no allowances for the married mother, but single mothers do get allowances for their children. So I think it would be a good idea to pay something to married mothers. So we're given information that's being presented to us as objective fact. So we're not interested in how accurate that fact is, but it's presented to us as objective facts around allowances for married versus single mothers. And as a basis of that fact, the caller then leads on to so I think, and the upshot of the objective facts are the argument that she wants to make. So it's sort of doing this work where the facts are grounding the speaker's subjective position. So there's this really interesting objectivity-subjectivity relationship where the subjectivity is presented as an upshot of the objective facts. And that's a really neat way of managing the potentially problematic nature that can come up if we just come off as being solely subjective. So just to conclude with the final slide then, what is it that thinking does in public debate? Well, in our data, what we identify is it enables the business of talk radio, and I would suggest other public debates, to be opened up as spaces for subjectivity where thinking matters. It allows speakers to really manage and accomplish their displays of commitment, which allows them to kind of do reasonableness to avoid confrontation. So it's not just about commitment to their own arguments and their own opinions, but it's also managing their commitment to what other people are saying within debates. And then there is this really nice way that think contributes to argument building by integrating facts and opinions in chains of argument to kind of build up to the broad arguments that a speaker would like to make. And that's it. I think I'm just about in time, so I will leave it there and I will hand back over.
Great. Thank you so much. Your work is so topical, and so many of the presentations today feel really immediate and urgent and relevant to some of the kind of most pressing and maybe worrisome issues that we're facing globally. So I really appreciate it. And the same is certainly true for our next presenter as well. I'm just inviting up to the stage Chris McVitie. The title of his talk will be, "We Need to Get Real and Get After the Hard Issues, Not the Soft Ones. Puzzle Resolution and Challenge in Online Discussions of Racism." Let's see. Oh. Gonna try one more time to get Chris McVitie up to the stage. Here we go. Looking promising.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and hello, everybody. Good
All right.
to see so many people here today, if only in a virtual sense.
Great. I can see you and hear you now. Welcome.
All right, just going to try and share my screen here, so we'll see how this goes. Sorry, bear with me. This worked okay before, but obviously not this time. All right, okay, let's one to go.
You're not seeing your slides?
I'm not, but any luck?
Give it one more try, and in the meantime, I'll get them open on my side so that I can show them if...
Are we showing now?
It doesn't work for you. Something's happening? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
But are we on the first slide? It says prejudice and discourse. Is that your first one?
That's the second one. We'll skip the title since we've already done that.
Okay.
It's rather than try and go back again. But today what I want to talk about is some work that I did with colleagues Andy McKinley and Rachel Monroe that looks at the discursive negotiation of prejudice and interaction, particularly in the context of online discussions. Now, in recent years, there's been a lot of discursive work on prejudice and related issues. The discursive perspective being that all of these are matters of negotiation in talk. They don't represent what is going on internally for speakers, but rather are to do with how they manage talk and how it will be received by other people. Much of this stems from the classic work of Margie Wetherell and Jonathan Potter in 1992, mapping the language of racism. And Wetherell and Potter's argument basically was that where people are talking about target groups or others in terms that might be heard as discriminatory or prejudiced, they will manage that talk to dodge the identity of prejudice. And this basic argument has been taken up in much of the work conducted in discursive psychology since then. What you find if you look at a lot of this is that speakers' strategies come under two main headings. One is a strategy of inoculation, where people will attempt to distance themselves from arguments that will be heard as discriminatory against other groups. You have the often quoted, "I'm not a racist, but," and the but is followed by talk that would be heard as clearly prejudicial. The initial disclaimer attempts to distance the speaker from being treated as someone who has formed a prejudgment about the group that is being talked about. The second strategy is one of attention deflection, commonly found in situations where talk is about action to recognize rights of a group who are suffering disadvantage or similar, and speakers will attempt to deflect attention onto talk of a broader or more collective group. So that, for instance, if you're talking about rights of Indigenous people, then the topic will shift to talk about a collective national group, and the rights of the indigenous group become subsumed into that sort of talk. The problem with a lot of this work, however, is that little of it really has addressed the issue of what speakers are attempting to dodge. That most of it assumes that we know pretty obviously what is to count as prejudice, what is to count as racism, and that there is some broad consensus as to what falls under these headings, but that they are really left to a large extent unexamined. However, if you look at what happens in everyday conversation and everyday life, then consensus often is far from being the case. Let me offer you this example, for instance, where you see three people dressed in a particular way with their faces darkened, so as at least potentially, if not intentionally, to depict certain characters in a practice that is commonly referred to as either blacking up or adopting blackface. And the question arises as to how we should understand this type of behaviour. And as you'll see, opinions on this diverge greatly. If we look at these two extracts taken from late 2019, the first comes from Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister at that time seeking re-election. And in the course of the re-election campaign, it transpired and it came to public knowledge that on previous occasions in his earlier days, Trudeau had adopted blackface on various occasions. And when this came to light in the campaign, his response was to offer an apology. Darkening your face, regardless of the context of the circumstances, is always unacceptable because of the racist history of blackface. I should have understood that then, and I never should have done it. Contrast that with the second extract that you see there, coming shortly after Trudeau's apology and in a similar sort of discussion. This comes from UK Conservative MP Desmond Swayne, who also states that he had adopted blackface on a previous occasion. And what he says is, I once went to a Blues Brothers themed fancy dress party as James Brown. I went to some trouble to be as authentic as possible. I can assure readers of this column that I have no intention of apologising. So what you see there are two highly contrasting approaches to blackface and how it is to be understood in current society. And it is that forms the context for the present study, that what we set out to do was to examine how individuals in interaction contest issues of racism, especially in relation to blackface or blacking up. Now, the data come from a discussion that followed an episode that occurred in a remote community in Scotland, UK. That there had been the annual gala parade in a remote town in northern Scotland, and to participate in that, three young people had adopted blackface, the three characters that you saw a few slides ago. This incident was reported to local police, but was also reported widely in the UK national media amid accusations of racism. Subsequently, the local community on their discussion board opened a thread titled Gollywogs, in which this incident became the focus of attention. And there were exchanges involving both people defending the actions of the three young people and those criticising them. So we examined these using principles of conversation analysis and discursive psychology. Have a look at this first exchange, or this first contribution rather, that comes from one contributor to the board, calling himself John 33, And this basically falls into three parts. I'll start with the part highlighted in yellow that comes in the middle there between lines 2 and 6, where John 33 argues in relation to the three young people. I am sure they never intended any racism whatsoever, just dressing up for a good night out. Type in gollywog in Google Images, and many thousands of images are shown, all of dolls, which I am sure they were trying to represent. So what do you see in this argument from John 33? Basically, the two strategies identified in previous work. First, you have the argument that there is no intention, that therefore the young people should be inoculated against any prejudgment involved in this instance. And secondly, that attention is being deflected onto a different group entirely. In fact, here it is not a different group of people, but a group of dolls. That, according to John 33's argument, this is what they were trying to represent. The problem, however, that John 33 has here is that these are recognizable as attempts to dodge accusations of racism. But in this instance, the accusations have already been made. It is too late to dodge them. And therefore, this in itself is unlikely to work as a suitable response. So what you see in the remainder of this posting from John 33 is another structure that attempts to dodge and, moreover, to resolve the issue that has arisen. At lines 1 to 2, you see what is framed as a puzzle. Now, the news that these young people who dressed up as gollywogs during Wig Gala has gone viral. The world has gone crazy. And in the later part of John 33's argument, from line 7 onwards, at the moment, ISIS are killing many thousands of people by throwing them off high buildings, drowning them in cages, mass execution, etc., as all the supposed great nations of this world stand back or make a very poor token effort to suppress it. We need to get real and get after the hard issues, not the soft ones. So in the first part of the extract, then, we have the puzzle. The world has gone crazy. So this is explicable and yet needs some explanation. And the resolution comes at the later part, that there are violent actions occurring that are of major international importance, that these are not receiving the attention that they should. All supposed great nations of the world are failing to respond appropriately. And the resolution, therefore, is that we need to get real and get after the hard issues, not the soft ones. People who accuse the young people of racism are focusing on the wrong issues here. This, of course, does not necessarily settle the issue. That an attempted puzzle resolution such as this one is itself open to challenge, and quickly met with challenge from other people posting on the discussions. Have a look at this type of response from another contributor. This one comes from someone calling themselves Better Together. And you see, this relies basically initially on a description of those who have leveled the accusations, who are criticizing the young people of being involved in racist activity. And what Better Together has to say about this is, so a total of 15 news outlets have run the story, all condemning the actions of those who decided to black up for the gala. Then we have the historic, over the last 20 years, of condemnation of the use of the term and why it's considered racially offensive. So the references here to the number of news outlets involved, to the length of time involved, the last 20 years, are designed rhetorically to sort of emphasize the weight of feeling that this is inappropriate behavior, that this is something that should be regarded as constituting racism. The second part of the contrast is what comes below it. Here we have the great and wise people of Caithness deciding that regardless of what opinions are nationwide, they are the arbiters of what is and isn't racially acceptable. The great and wise people of Caithness clearly can be heard as ironic in this context. And the claim is that they are ignoring what is going on a wider basis, that they themselves are to be treated as the sole arbiters. And after that, what you get is the upshot, Better Together, arguing that we should take note of the rest of the country rather than a few people who'd rather bury their heads in the sand and pretend things haven't changed since the 1970s. So put these together and what you're really getting is a restatement of how the behaviour of the three young people should be characterised. This is to be understood as constituting racism. So in total disagreement with John 33's sort of arguments that we saw before. However, Better Together does not stop there. If we look at the next part of the contribution, then what Better Together argues here is maybe you'll all be happy when the media starts quoting some of your comments in the press to show how racially intolerant and unaware you are. It's not for white people in a predominantly white populous town to decide whether it's racially offensive. Don't you see how bigoted your responses are? So the turn isn't then not just reclassifying the actions of the young people as racist, but it turns into a direct criticism of those such as John 33 who attempt to defend them through puzzle resolution. The puzzle resolution, or the attempted puzzle resolution, has itself become a target for attack. So, Better Together and others of a similar ilk in the discussion criticised the attempt to construct the accusations of racism as a puzzle and the attempt at puzzle resolution that followed from that. That these arguments by John 33 and others certainly did not settle the issue of what is to count as racism. And instead, it becomes evidence that those seeking to defend the three young people are themselves to be treated as being racially intolerant and bigoted in this context. So, let me offer you some conclusions from this. First, that the discursive strategy adopted by John 33 of puzzle resolution certainly offers one way of responding to, rather than simply dodging, accusations of racism. However, it is bound up with its own interactional problems, as we've seen. But as is clear from these and other contributions to the board, there is no consensus as to what is counted as prejudice or racism, that there is not the level of consensus, or here indeed any, that much of the previous discursive work on these topics has suggested. Nor is there any agreement as to who is to get to decide what is to count as prejudice or racism. That equally is a matter of contention. What we can clearly see, however, is that these are concerns for the participants, that these are the basis of what they're trying to negotiate in their interactions here and elsewhere. But as a take-home message, what all of this does point to are some of the challenges that we encounter in attempting to challenge racism or potential racism in current society. If there is no agreement, no consensus as to how behaviour such as this is to be understood and or responded to, then it becomes very difficult to meaningfully try and address sort of racism in at least some of its forms, because the accusations made themselves become opened up, and so we end up going down the path of possible resolution, challenge, more dispute, and on it goes. On that note, I will say thank you, and I'll stop there.
Terrific. Thank you very much. So I'm just inviting all the participants up to the stage now for our last half an hour will be a period of question and answer, about 25 minutes we have. So we've already seen a few questions coming in under Ask a Question, which is great. And just want to encourage all of you to share your questions for our panelists. I will be kind of taking the questions, summarizing them, and announcing them to the participants in the panel. So while these are coming in, there was just one question that I wanted to throw out there for all of you, which is, where do you see your work going from here? The initial title of this presentation, this panel was Directions in Discursive Psychology, and certainly there are lots of different directions that these projects could go in. So I wanted to hear a little bit from anybody who wanted to share where are you heading next from here?
I think we're all waiting for each other to speak, aren't we? So I'll jump in. Yeah, I mean, there's so much work that I could sort of do from this point. As I say, that this kind of focus on a particular element of talk is not typically what I do. I'm normally sort of doing work around examining the way that identity construction gets done. But actually, what's interesting in this work, I think, is that you start to see how, the mental state terms or cognitive verbs are really useful tools for people building strong rhetorical arguments. And those strong rhetorical arguments, then what's interesting is where are those being developed? So that's when you get back to the kind of identity work. But one of the things that I think I am certainly interested in exploring going forward is, anecdotally, I haven't done the analysis yet, but anecdotally, my feeling is there is a difference between the way men and women do their think and talk. And my sense is that there is more minus commitment, tentativity in the way that women are doing their thinking talk in much of these debates. Not exclusively so, but there is more of that. And with men, there is more of the kind of sort of public speaking, even though they're lay speakers, members of the public, but they're kind of engaging in a political argument, so they're doing the upgrading, I think. So there's some very interesting gendered differences, I think, in the way that people do thinking talk. And the other thing I have to apologise for is once you start looking at this, you just cannot stop hearing how many times you say think in your own talk. We use it enormously. But yeah, so that exploration of gendered differences around thinking talk is something that I would like to explore.
Given what Laura just said, I think I can go next. So I'm basically looking at how targets of discrimination in various ways, right, based on their group membership in terms of sex, gender, race, ethnicity, caste, identities, regional identities, so on and so forth. How is it they manage issues of concern for them, depending on the types of discrimination that target groups routinely face? They will face a problem in reporting this actual discrimination or negotiating issues that they face. So that's where I see the next steps of my work going. So for example, Chris and I are currently doing the special issue in DJSP on race and racism, which to me at least forms part of that work on how your category membership that you belong to or you're seen as a member of a particular category has an impact on the types of complaints you can make, cannot make, how your complaints are taken up, not taken up, dismissed, undermined, so on and so forth. That's my direction of work.
For myself, I think I would say, it's amazing how many times you do say, I think, so attention's drawn to it. I'd say going in sort of two possibly slightly different directions. One, if we approach prejudice talk on the basis that a lot of this is contentious, that there is no overall consensus suggested by much of previous work, then I'd be interested to open that up and see what other moves are available down the line for either attempting to justify it or challenge likewise. So that's one way I would see it going. Another, I guess, is to consider whether that sort of structure of puzzle resolution applies also in other contexts in conversation. Is it a particular unique feature of racist type talk, or is it more common in other everyday talk on different topics? So it'd be interesting to explore those sort of possibilities.
Great. Thank you. We've got a question here for Laura from Emily Foster. Wants to know, did you look into how the other cognitive verbs were used in your data? E.g., can believe also indicate both plus and minus commitment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when we first started looking at this data, we actually coded it for a number of different cognitive verbs, mental state terms, and primarily we coded it for thinking, feeling, and believing. And so originally we were going to analyse all of that, but actually we focused on thinking because the prominence of thinking compared to the others was just, enormous. So there was very little use of belief or believing, mainly linked to topics. So it was where the focus of the talks was around aspects of religion. And so then you'd see belief come in as in religious belief. And on occasions you would see it coming elsewhere in, people talking about it's my belief X, but it was very limited. And in the same way, feeling featured slightly more than belief, but feeling was still very, very, as I say, there were many of the 11 shows that had no talk of belief or feelings, but there was nothing like the numbers of thinking. But feelings are interesting because there are occasions where, whilst they're not as prominent, but there are certain occasions where when speakers use feelings in the context of their argument or their view, that it will trump thinking. And it's normally to do with people's membership categories. So for example, if you're speaking as a mother who has lost a child, as was in one of these debates, to talk from how you feel is rhetorically very, very powerful versus how you think. So there are fewer instances of these other kinds of cognitive verbs, but they often will play a very particular role that, when used in that context, will be a very powerful tool. And again, what I sort of was mapping this against was thinking, feeling, and believing. So thinking is that kind of rationality, isn't it? That, we're doing our rational business, our cognitive business of demonstrating our sense making, which is powerful in our Western discourse, that we're supposed to be rational beings. So it really speaks to that, which I think is why we see such prevalence of it. So certainly you do see other cognitive verbs being used, much less, but I think they perform some really interesting work where they are used. So that's something else I would like to explore.
Thank you. So we've got a question here from Tom Isherwood, who says, fabulous to hear great analysis based on real everyday discourse. I'm interested in how the presenters respond to challenges that are typically formatted as, that's interesting, but inoculation. What should we do with these findings? What's the point?
Do you want me to have a go?
Yeah.
So, always a good question, that one. I mean, for myself, I think that the findings that are presented here should make, or potentially should make, policymakers and others more alive to the subtleties of how racism is negotiated in society, that rather than coming out with blanket ideas of what constitutes hate speech or anything else, that perhaps need to at least step back and think carefully about what it is that we're looking to address and how that might be contested in different arenas. May not suggest any quick take-home formula, this is what you do here, but I think it at least opens up issues for discussion and for broader debate.
I would maybe, I agree with everything that Chris just said, but I think another area which I increasingly see opening up is applied research that's using discursive psychology and conversation analysis to sort of do empirical analysis of qualitative data that's got a real applied use. So an example would be, I have a colleague who's recently published work in health psychology, and they're examining people. So the research is around how do you improve medication adherence for people who've got cystic fibrosis. So medication adherence is crucial to keeping people alive. And one of the common problems or issues when people are taking medication every day, multiple medications for the rest of their life, is adherence, is taking it. And one of the things that often comes up as a problem is people forget. Now, if you take forgetting at face value and go, well, people aren't taking this medication because they forget it, then what we have are lots of health psychologists who are developing interventions around helping people remember. So apps on their phone so that it reminds them you need to take your medication. When they did a discourse analysis of what is it people are doing with their forgetting talk, what became very clear was people may say they forget, but what they're actually doing is managing the moral business of, not taking medication when that's keeping them alive. So it's not necessarily that they were actually forgetting to take the medication, but forgetting is a way of explaining why you're not doing something that the world expects you to do, even though there's really complex reasons why you might not take that medication. So in that discursive analysis, what they really opened up was actually it's not as simple as we need to create interventions to remind people, because forgetting isn't actually the problem here. Forgetting is what people are doing in their talk. We need to get below that to really understand at a more deep level what's going on, and therefore to be able to develop interventions that will fully support people in engaging. I hope that makes some sense, but for me that's some of the other so whatness of discursive work and CA work, is that there is a real applied tool for it.
I agree with both Chris and Laura. But I mean, my work is perhaps less suited to the kind of applications that Laura is sketching out in terms of interventions or understanding specific adherence and things. For example, this paper and the findings here are perhaps more relevant to how do you, as Chris was saying, how do you formulate a policy? So India currently has two sets of policies against sexual harassment in their workplace. The Vishaka Guidelines and the POSH Act, which came in 2013. But despite that, you see increasing numbers of sexual harassment cases. But at the same time, you have evidence that says that reporting is a problem. So I suppose a lacuna there is that the aspect of what is involved in reporting is not completely understood. So studies such as this and others, of course, right, that talk to how in dealing with these types of concerns and issues, that for people reporting can be treated as an individual burden, as it were. And one of the things that they might want to do is not make it an individual burden, but treat it as an issue that they, as members of a group, face. So the hope is that these types of findings will make their way through policy, through advocacy, right, or through events like this, and that will have some impact on how policymakers think about these issues. That's where I see and of course the knowledge itself. This is how I would see the potentialness of the applied aspects of my work.
Thank you. We've got a question here from Fred Wirtz. I'm going to summarize a little bit in the interest of time. But basically, the question is asking about, and everyone can take a look at it in the question window too, is the role of mental and subjectivity in DA. And he asks, to what extent and how, if at all, does the method include the subjective or first-person meaningfulness of the situation, of personal goals of discourse, and are the outcomes or responses to discourse? To what extent does DA kind of dementalize, and to what extent does it account for or engage with subjectivity, and how? I hope I summarized that well.
I'll have a stab at that. I think it's a really good question. I mean, you know, and the paper I've just shared is a good example of this, that in discursive psychology approaches, it is studying the way that talk and language works as social business and social action. So even in the doing of our, you know, subjectivity, of our thinking or our emotions or our feelings, that the focus of DP is on how that works as social business. And, you know, I think there are a whole range of qualitative methods, and rightly so, because sometimes what we want to understand is an embodied experience, or, you know, taking at face value those feelings or that subjectivity, and honouring that for that person's experience. I don't know that DP is necessarily the right tool to do that kind of work. At the same time, I think there is something about joining those things up. So we may, you know, we experience the thing that we experience, but we've got to share that through the talk that we do about that experience. And that talk is doing some kind of social work, whether that's enabling people to connect with us around whatever it might be, grief, anger, rage, whatever. So I think some of the tools of discursive psychology can help us understand how people connect with another person's subjective experience, or how that's shared. And so in Rahul's work, you know, the way in which people can share their experience of assault or sexual abuse or sexual harassment, you know, in what ways are some of those accounts perhaps received better, or understood in ways that seem to connect better? Not to say that they should be, or, you know, it's not about making a moral judgment, but are there things we can understand about the kind of rhetoric of talk that might help us understand how some accounts, or the presenting of information in certain ways, seems to be met with a better reception than other ways? I don't know if that helps, and I'm happy for Chris and Rahul to weigh in on this one.
So happy for Rahul to weigh in, and that I was skimming the questions on the sort of ask a question list.
Sure, and I think I missed the Ms. Elizabeth's summary of it, so I'm just going to address the last part of Fred's question, which talks about how the terms that we might use as analysts have are merely words done by the searcher, and or do they imply discursive practices with certain social consequences, which are valued in different ways by different people, I suppose. And if I hear that correct, I'm guessing Fred is getting to the point of, do you, so when you say that there is a legitimacy to the complaint, or the legitimacy of the complaint is managed, when I, the practice that the bit of data that I refer to, in what ways the legitimacy is there? I suppose, I think, I'm guessing that's what the question is referring to. And if that is the case, I suppose my own take is that one of the places that analysts are required to come from when doing DA is that you are somebody who's a member of the culture in which the data are taking place. And by culture, it is not meant culture with a capital C, such as, you know, South Asian culture or American culture, where somebody understands that there is something called a complaint, and these complaints can be treated as just being done for no reason or being done for with intent, so on and so forth. So when we as analysts analyze data, we have, or there is the expectation that we know that when someone is saying hello, for instance, at some point it is a greeting, and hello at another point in the interaction is not a greeting, right? So it's there are no criteria for specifying when I use the word legitimacy to refer to some sort of data or the action being done, that there is some sort of objective check on it. I suppose it's a community of researchers, peer reviewers, or people in the audience, for example, who would be like, well, I don't think that was a legitimacy of the complaint that was being attended to. That's how I understand the question. But I suppose Chris has another take on it.
Well, I guess I don't know if that's a cognitive verb or not, but Laura can tell me. I guess I would fall back on the traditional CA type line that, I mean, it's not just me saying that this is a challenge or a resolution or anything else, but rather a question of how other participants respond to it. I mean, are they treating it as legitimate, not legitimate, working as a puzzle resolution or not? Or, I mean, how are they treating it, and what can we see in their responses that make sense of the interaction? Now, I know that CA line isn't everyone's taste, but that I think is part of the CADP repertoire. That so it is not us as analysts trying to impose our understanding on it, but rather trying to analyze how those involved are treating what they're receiving from other participants.
Great. So we've got a bunch of questions in the chat. I don't think we're going to have time to get to all of them, unfortunately. I do want to say there was a question that came up around preserving and sharing public data and data related to the projects that has been sort of taken up a little bit in the chat window. So I just wanted to acknowledge that that's been a topic of conversation here tonight for those of us who may be watching the video and not seeing the chat. And then I think the last question we'll have time for is from Heidi Levitt, who wonders if you notice whether there are systematic differences in the way these methods, DA methods, CA methods, are designed, implemented, or focused across varied countries, regions, cultures, or questions.
So I can only speak for my work, and I've only done analysis based in UK or US data. So I think it's a really good question, that if you think about the way people talk and the way people use language, that's variable, right? So there's a range of work, certainly in CA, that's found kind of systematic findings in different types of data from different cultures, but to the extent of how systematic that is not something I will be able to answer. I don't know whether, Rahul, that kind of is something you would want to pick up, given your kind of analysis of data from India.
So I've looked at data from the UK, Ireland, India. So I have that experience looking at data from different geographical settings, geopolitical settings, and also different cultures with a capital C in that sense. Okay, in terms of how I would go about collecting data, conducting a study, or doing the analysis, not many differences in how the study itself will be conducted. In the analysis, if I would say yes, or at least in my analysis, I see that I analyze talk coming from different types of data along these criteria to have in a different way. I'm unsure of the systematicity of it. So I would say yes, there are differences. I'm not unsure of the systematicity of it. And in terms of, I think perhaps a more important thing is I would have for me, the research question would be different for these settings. I think that determines how I proceed with the analysis of these different types of data. But I think, as Laura was saying, I think it's a great question. I think systematicity is an interesting question there. But yeah, that's what I would say about that.
Well, I mean, my experience, I would say, is limited to English-speaking countries where I haven't been necessarily aware of any systematic differences. I mean, yes, there are cultural differences, but you would expect them to see reflected in the talk. However, I wouldn't want to generalize beyond English-speaking world to anything beyond that. Rahul probably is better placed than I am, and as are others. So I think it'd be shaky ground to make those sort of claims.
For me, for example, sorry, just one note. So I work with data which are both in English and not in English. And that bit of when you're translating data from non-English languages to English for the sake of publication, basically, and adhering and bringing in DA or CA, which are primarily originated in the English-speaking world, and making sure that they capture what's being accomplished in the data. I think there's a lot of work to be done there as a method, as a practice, as an analytic practice. A lot of work to be done there, and I think the question of systematicity could be a useful guide in doing more work there. So that's all I wanted to say.
Well, I just wanted to say it's wonderful that we have such an international group here tonight, and in acknowledgement of that and the fact that it is getting a little bit late for you, and I appreciate your willingness to schedule this all together at a time that's getting a little late into the evening for those of us in the United Kingdom. I just wanted to say thank you again for putting this together, for sharing your insights and perspectives and expertise with all of us. It's been a wonderful conversation, both what we've seen on screen, what we've seen going on in the chat and the questions, and just a lot of really important issues getting raised. And I think we've all learned a lot. So does anyone have any last comments or things that they want to say before we close out?
Yeah, well, just thanks to you, Elizabeth, for sharing it so well, and all your help.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure, and really nice to see so many people coming along and listening in. So although we can't see them, it's been nice to know we're part of the SQIP community still.
And I'd like to echo their thoughts. And Elizabeth, thank you so much, and thanks to SQIP and the audience for being here.
Terrific. All right, take care, everyone. Have a good evening.
And